3 hours before his scheduled execution, Vincent Romano made a request that left an entire prison in stunned silence. It wasn't for his attorney. It wasn't for a priest. It wasn't even for the son who hadn't visited him in nearly 6 years. Instead, the once powerful man looked through the thick glass partition of the interview room and spoke 4 simple words. Find Grace Johnson. The correctional officer blinked, certain he had misheard. Vincent Romano had spent decades as one of the most influential men in Chicago. Newspapers had written about him for years. Television crews had camped outside courthouses just to capture a glimpse of him. Yet now, with the final hours of his life slipping away minute by minute, the only person he wanted to see was a Black Maid who had disappeared almost a decade ago. The officer checked the file again. No family member by that name. No attorney. No emergency contact. Just a former household employee. Sir, the officer said carefully, are you sure that's who you want us to locate? Vincent slowly turned his head toward him. At 57, his hair had turned almost completely silver. The sharp confidence that once intimidated boardrooms and city officials had faded into something quieter, something heavier. But his blue eyes remained steady. She's the only one who can help now. The words settled over the room like a cold winter fog. Outside the interview chamber, fluorescent lights hummed softly above long gray hallways. Doors opened and closed in the distance. Phones rang. Staff members moved between offices carrying folders and paperwork. Yet within minutes, whispers began spreading through the facility. Who was Grace Johnson? Why would Vincent Romano ask for a maid during his final hours? The questions multiplied faster than answers. By noon, even senior officials were discussing it behind closed doors. Some assumed she had been a trusted employee. Others believed she might have been hiding money, documents, or secrets connected to Vincent's past. Nobody imagined the truth was far more important than any of those theories. Meanwhile, nearly 800 miles away, a woman sat alone on a weathered front porch in a small Georgia town. Grace Johnson rocked gently in an old wooden chair as afternoon sunlight filtered through the oak trees lining her property. The house was modest. The paint had faded. The mailbox leaned slightly toward the road. It was the kind of place people passed without noticing. Exactly how Grace preferred it. She wore a simple blue sweater despite the warm weather and held a mug of tea between both hands. For 8 years, she had lived quietly. No interviews. No social media. No contact with anyone connected to the Romano family. She had worked hard to disappear from that chapter of her life forever. Then a black government sedan rolled slowly into her driveway. Grace watched it approach without moving. Something deep inside her chest tightened. She knew before the driver even stepped out. Some memories never truly leave. Some names never stop echoing through the years. The man walked toward her carrying an official envelope. His expression was serious, respectful, almost nervous. Grace stared at the envelope for several long seconds before finally accepting it. Then she read the first line. Her hands immediately began to tremble. Vincent Romano was asking for her. And for the first time in 8 years, the past had come looking for her again. Grace Johnson read the letter 3 times before lowering it into her lap. The words did not change. The official seal remained the same. Vincent Romano was requesting her presence immediately. The sun dipped lower behind the trees as a warm breeze stirred the grass surrounding her small property, but Grace barely noticed. Her eyes remained fixed on the paper. 8 years. 8 long years since she had spoken his name out loud. 8 years since she had walked away from the Romano estate carrying nothing but 2 suitcases and memories she had spent nearly a decade trying to bury. The man standing beside the government sedan shifted uneasily. Miss Johnson, we can arrange transportation within the hour. Grace did not answer. Her thoughts had already drifted back to Chicago. Back to the mansion that overlooked Lake Michigan. Back to polished marble floors that reflected crystal chandeliers. Back to hallways so large they echoed when no one spoke. She had arrived there at 34 years old after losing nearly everything. Her husband had passed away after a long illness. Medical bills had consumed her savings. She needed work, and the Romano household paid better than any employer in the city. What she expected was a difficult job. What she found was something entirely different. Most people who worked in the mansion viewed Vincent Romano the same way the public did. Powerful, untouchable, intimidating. Staff members lowered their voices when he entered a room. Guests carefully measured every word around him. Even seasoned executives seemed nervous during meetings. Yet Grace noticed something few others did. Behind the expensive suits and commanding presence was a man who spent most evenings alone. She would see him standing beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake long after everyone else had gone to bed. Sometimes he remained there for hours, staring into darkness without moving. The loneliness in those moments never matched the image newspapers printed on their front pages. Grace never asked questions. She simply did her job. She cleaned rooms, prepared guest suites, organized schedules, made certain everything functioned smoothly behind the scenes. For years, she remained nearly invisible. That was how household employees survived in places like that. Invisible people avoided trouble. Invisible people kept their jobs. But Vincent noticed things. He noticed when she worked late without complaint. He noticed when she left homemade soup outside the room of a sick employee. He noticed when she quietly paid for another staff member's emergency prescription after learning her insurance would not cover it. Grace never told anyone about those moments. She assumed nobody knew. Yet somehow Vincent always seemed aware. One snowy December evening, after a long charity gala filled with politicians and business leaders, Grace had been collecting abandoned glasses from a ballroom when Vincent appeared unexpectedly beside her. "Why do you do it?" he asked. Grace looked up, confused. "Do what, sir?" Vincent glanced toward a young janitor working near the doorway. "Help everyone when nobody is watching." Grace remembered smiling softly before returning a tray to the table. Because somebody should. It was one of the shortest conversations they ever shared. Yet for reasons she never understood, Vincent seemed to remember it. The government representative cleared his throat gently. "Miss Johnson." Grace blinked as the memory dissolved. The porch returned. The trees returned. The envelope remained in her hands. Slowly she folded the letter and looked toward the distant horizon. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, a man she had not seen in 8 years was waiting. And for the first time since leaving Chicago, Grace found herself wondering why Vincent Romano had never forgotten her. The drive to Atlanta took less than an hour. The flight to Chicago took another 2. Yet to Grace it felt as though she were traveling through years rather than miles. She sat beside the window of the small government aircraft, watching clouds drift beneath the wing while memories surfaced one after another. By the time the Chicago skyline appeared on the horizon, she had already revisited moments she thought she had left behind forever. At the correctional facility, the atmosphere had changed. Reporters crowded outside the gates. Television vans lined the street. Rumors had spread beyond the prison walls and into newsrooms across the country. Commentators debated the mystery woman Vincent Romano wanted to see. Some claimed she was a former confidant. Others suggested she possessed information about hidden assets or old business dealings. Nobody knew the truth. Inside the facility, Vincent sat alone at a small metal table. A clock hung on the wall across from him. He had barely touched the meal delivered earlier. The untouched tray rested near the corner of the room while he stared at a photograph worn soft from years of handling. It showed a younger version of the Romano estate. Most people would have noticed the mansion. Vincent only noticed one person standing near the front steps. Grace. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. The prison chaplain stepped inside. "Would you like company?" he asked gently. Vincent shook his head. "Not yet." The chaplain nodded. "They are trying to locate her." Vincent lowered his eyes to the photograph. "She is already on her way." The certainty in his voice surprised even himself. Across town, another conversation was unfolding. Anthony Romano slammed a folder onto a polished conference table inside his attorney's office. At 34 years old, Vincent's only son carried many of his father's features, but very little of his patience. "This makes no sense," Anthony said. 8 years. She vanished for 8 years. Now suddenly she matters more than family. The attorney remained calm. "Your father specifically requested her." "Why?" Anthony demanded. "Nobody will tell me why." The attorney hesitated before answering. "Perhaps because she knows something." Anthony froze. Those 4 words settled heavily between them. Knows something. The possibility had haunted him since the rumors began. He remembered Grace from childhood. She had worked quietly in the background. She attended school events when his father was busy. She remembered birthdays. She made sure every employee received a gift during the holidays. Yet despite all those years, Anthony realized he knew almost nothing about her. What conversations had happened when nobody was watching? What had his father shared that nobody else heard? Back at the prison, an officer hurried down the hallway carrying new paperwork. Another officer followed close behind. Their expressions were tense. The search had produced unexpected results. Records showed Grace Johnson had changed addresses multiple times after leaving Chicago. She had intentionally disappeared. More surprising was the discovery that she had never spoken publicly about Vincent Romano, not once. No interviews, no books, no payments, no attempts to profit from his downfall. She had simply walked away. The lead investigator stared at the file before quietly muttering, "People do not disappear like this unless they are protecting something." And somewhere above the clouds, as Grace's plane descended toward Chicago, the truth everyone had been searching for was moving steadily closer. The aircraft touched down just after sunset. Rain had begun falling across Chicago, coating runways and highways in reflections of red and white lights. Grace remained seated for several seconds after the plane stopped moving. Through the small oval window, she could see vehicles waiting nearby and officials standing beneath umbrellas. Everything felt strangely familiar. The city had changed over the years, yet the weight she felt in her chest was exactly the same. As she stepped onto the tarmac, a cold wind swept across the airfield. One of the officials approached immediately. "Miss Johnson, thank you for coming." Grace offered a polite nod, but said nothing. Her attention drifted toward the skyline, glowing in the distance. Somewhere beyond those lights sat a man whose life was measured in hours rather than years. The drive from the airport passed through neighborhoods she once knew well. Restaurants had new names. Buildings had new owners. Entire blocks looked different. Yet memories continued appearing at every turn. The old church where she used to volunteer. The grocery store where she bought supplies for the mansion. The small bakery Vincent secretly favored despite insisting he never ate sweets. Each memory made the years separating past and present feel smaller. At the prison, preparations intensified. Additional staff had arrived. Lawyers reviewed documents. Reporters crowded against security barriers outside the gates despite the steady rain. Inside a conference room, Anthony Romano paced back and forth. His frustration had grown into something deeper. Fear. Not fear of what was happening to his father. Fear of what he might learn. A senior investigator entered carrying a thick file. "We found more information about Grace Johnson." Anthony stopped pacing immediately. "What kind of information?" The investigator opened the folder. "For starters, she received multiple offers from publishers after your father's trial. Every single one was rejected." Anthony frowned. "So, she could have earned millions telling stories about your family. She never accepted a penny." The investigator turned another page. "She also declined interview requests from national networks, documentary producers, and reporters." Anthony folded his arms. "Maybe she wanted privacy. Maybe," the investigator replied quietly. "Or maybe she was protecting someone." The room fell silent. Those words echoed in Anthony's mind long after the investigator left. Protecting someone. The possibility unsettled him more than any headline ever had. Meanwhile, Grace sat alone in the back seat of a government vehicle approaching the facility. Streetlights passed overhead in steady intervals. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, but her thoughts were far from calm. She remembered one particular night years earlier. A storm had struck the city, knocking out power across parts of the lakefront. Most employees had gone home. The mansion was unusually quiet. She had been collecting candles when she found Vincent sitting alone in darkness near a window overlooking the water. Neither spoke for several minutes. Then, without looking away from the lake, Vincent asked a question she never forgot. "Grace, do you think a person can spend a lifetime making mistakes and still leave one good thing behind?" She had answered honestly. "Only if they are brave enough to tell the truth before it is too late." As the prison gates appeared ahead through sheets of rain, that conversation returned with startling clarity. Because for the first time, Grace began to wonder whether that was exactly why Vincent had called for her. The prison gates opened slowly, revealing layers of fences, security checkpoints, and concrete walls illuminated by harsh white lights. Grace stepped out of the vehicle and pulled her coat closer around her shoulders. Rain continued falling in a steady rhythm, tapping softly against pavement and windows. An officer greeted her and guided her through a series of hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Doors opened with electronic clicks and closed with heavy finality behind them. With every step, Grace felt the distance between the past and present shrinking. She had imagined this moment many times during the flight, yet nothing prepared her for the reality of it. Somewhere ahead waited a man she had not seen in 8 years. A man whose name had dominated headlines, courtrooms, and television broadcasts. A man the world believed it understood. The officer finally stopped outside a private visitation room. Through the small glass panel, Grace could see a single table and 2 chairs beneath bright overhead lights. "Take all the time you need," the officer said quietly before stepping away. Grace stood motionless. Her hand rested against the door handle, but she did not turn it immediately. Instead, another memory surfaced. She remembered a spring morning nearly 12 years earlier. One of the gardeners had suffered a serious medical emergency while working on the estate grounds. Staff members panicked. Several people froze. Vincent happened to be returning from a meeting when he saw the commotion. Without hesitation, he canceled the rest of his schedule, stayed at the hospital for hours, and personally covered every expense. The gardener returned to work months later. Vincent never mentioned it again. Neither did the newspapers that claimed to know everything about him. Grace had learned, then, that some of the most important truths never became headlines. Taking a slow breath, she finally opened the door. Vincent Romano looked up immediately. For several seconds, neither spoke. Time seemed to stop. The years had changed them both. Vincent appeared thinner than she remembered. The confidence that once filled every room had softened into something quieter, more reflective. Yet his eyes remained unmistakable. Those same blue eyes studied her carefully, almost as if he feared she might disappear if he blinked. Grace slowly entered and closed the door behind her. "Hello, Vincent," she said softly. A faint smile appeared on his face. "You came." His voice carried relief so profound it nearly broke her heart. Grace sat across from him. "You asked for me." Vincent lowered his gaze for a moment before looking back up. "I was not sure you would." Silence settled between them. Not an uncomfortable silence. The kind shared by 2 people carrying memories too large for simple greetings. Finally, Grace spoke. 8 years is a long time." Vincent nodded. "I know." "Then why now?" she asked. "Why after all these years?" Vincent leaned back, slowly in his chair. The smile faded. The room suddenly felt smaller. He looked toward the ceiling for a moment as though searching for the right words. Then his eyes returned to hers. "Because there is something you saw that night." Grace felt her stomach tighten instantly. Her fingers froze against the edge of the table. The memory she had spent 8 years trying to escape came rushing back with startling clarity. And for the first time since arriving in Chicago, she realized this meeting was never about saying goodbye. Grace did not answer immediately. The room seemed to grow quieter with every passing second. Beyond the thick walls, life inside the facility continued as normal. Phones rang. Doors opened and closed. Footsteps echoed through distant corridors. Yet inside that small visitation room, none of it seemed to exist. Only the memory remained. Vincent watched her carefully. He could see it in her eyes. She remembered. The same way he remembered. The same way neither of them had ever truly escaped it. Grace slowly lowered her gaze to the table. "I spent 8 years trying not to think about that night," she said softly. Vincent nodded. "So did I." The answer surprised her. For years she had assumed he carried on with his life, while she disappeared into hers. Yet the man sitting across from her looked less like someone protecting a secret and more like someone carrying a burden. Grace folded her hands together. "You told everyone to leave early that evening." Vincent looked down. "I remember. The house was almost empty." "Yes. And you asked me to bring coffee to your office." Vincent closed his eyes briefly. Every detail returned with perfect clarity. The storm outside. The wind rattling windows overlooking the lake. The sound of rain against glass. The smell of coffee cooling on his desk. Grace had entered carrying a tray and found him standing near a bookshelf studying several documents. At the time it had seemed ordinary. Now they both knew it was the beginning of everything. Grace exhaled slowly. "I was halfway down the hallway when I realized I forgot my umbrella." Vincent remained silent. She continued. "I went back toward your office." Her voice grew quieter. "That is when I heard the conversation." For the first time, tension appeared in Vincent's face. Not fear. Not panic. Regret. Deep regret. Grace remembered standing near the partially open doorway. She had never intended to listen. In fact, She had planned to leave immediately. But one sentence stopped her. A sentence that made no sense at the time. A sentence she never forgot. Someone said they were going to blame you. Vincent slowly opened his eyes. Yes. I did not understand what it meant. Neither did I. Grace looked at him carefully. But you knew something was wrong. Vincent nodded. I knew enough. Silence settled between them once again. Then Grace asked the question she had carried for years. Why did you never tell anyone? Vincent looked toward the ceiling lights before answering. Because by the time I understood the truth, it was too late. His voice remained calm, but the sadness beneath it was impossible to miss. And because the only person who heard that conversation was you. Grace felt a chill run through her. I tried to forget it. I know. I moved away. I know. I changed my life. Vincent managed a faint smile. I know that too. Grace stared at him in disbelief. How? Vincent leaned forward slightly. Because I made sure nobody followed you. Nobody bothered you. Nobody came looking for you. Grace froze. For 8 years, she had believed her quiet life existed because she had hidden well enough. Now she realized something entirely different. Vincent had been protecting her all along. The realization left her speechless. Vincent looked directly into her eyes. Grace, there is a reason I asked you to come. His voice became steadier, more urgent. What you heard that night was not the whole truth. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken. Vincent reached into a folder resting beside his chair and placed a single document on the table between them. Then he said the words that changed everything. There is another witness, and I finally know where to find him. Grace stared at the document resting between them. The paper looked ordinary. A few pages clipped together. Several names. Dates. Notes written in careful handwriting. Yet Vincent treated it as though it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Slowly, Grace reached forward and opened the first page. Her eyes moved across the text. Then she froze. The name printed near the bottom was familiar. Very familiar. Harold Bennett, she whispered. Vincent nodded. You remember him. Grace remembered immediately. Harold Bennett had worked as the estate accountant for nearly 15 years. Quiet. Precise. The kind of man who blended into the background. He rarely attended events and avoided attention whenever possible. Most people barely noticed him. But Grace remembered his kindness. He always greeted employees by name. He remembered birthdays. He once spent an entire afternoon helping a housekeeper fix a complicated tax issue without charging a penny. Then one day, he simply disappeared. Nobody explained why. Nobody asked questions. I thought he moved away, Grace said. Vincent gave a sad smile. That is what everyone believed. Grace looked back at the file. What really happened? Vincent leaned forward. 3 months ago, my attorney received an anonymous letter. Grace listened carefully. Inside was a photograph, a phone number, and a message. Vincent paused. The message said Harold had been trying to tell the truth for years. The room fell silent. Grace felt her pulse quicken. For years she had convinced herself that the mystery surrounding that night would never be solved. Yet now every answer seemed closer than ever. Did you contact him? She asked. Vincent nodded slowly. Not directly. He glanced toward the folder. But someone did. Grace turned another page. There were records of phone calls, travel receipts, notes from investigators. The search had been happening quietly for months. While the world watched court proceedings and debated headlines, Vincent had been searching for one man. Where is he now? Grace asked. Vincent looked at her carefully. 200 miles north of here. Grace blinked. Alive? Yes. Relief washed across her face. Vincent continued. For years he believed nobody would listen. Grace lowered her eyes. She understood that feeling better than most people. How many nights had? She replayed fragments of memory while convincing herself they no longer mattered. How many mornings had she chosen silence because speaking seemed impossible? Vincent's voice softened. Grace, I never blamed you for leaving. She looked up. I blamed myself. The confession surprised both of them. Vincent remained quiet. Grace shook her head slowly. Maybe if I had spoken sooner. No. Vincent interrupted gently. You survived the best way you could. The words hung between them. For years nobody had said that to her. Nobody had acknowledged how much fear and uncertainty she had carried. A knock sounded at the door. Both turned. An officer entered carrying a folder and a serious expression. Mr. Romano. Vincent immediately recognized the look on the man's face. Something had changed. What is it? The officer swallowed. We just received confirmation. Grace felt her heart pounding. Vincent slowly stood. Confirmation of what? The officer looked directly at him. Harold Bennett has agreed to testify, and he is already on his way here. The news spread through the facility faster than anyone expected. Within minutes, attorneys were making calls, investigators were reviewing files, and senior officials were gathering in conference rooms that had been empty only moments before. The atmosphere shifted from quiet resignation to cautious urgency. Grace sat beside Vincent, watching people move quickly beyond the glass walls of the visitation area. For the first time since arriving, she noticed something different in his expression. Hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. Across the building, Anthony Romano stood frozen as an attorney repeated the update. Harold Bennett was coming. The words seemed impossible. For years, Harold had existed only as a forgotten name buried in old records. Now he was suddenly the most important person in Illinois. Anthony lowered himself into a chair. Questions flooded his mind. If Harold had remained silent for all these years, why speak now? Why wait until the final hours? And what exactly did he know? Outside, the rain continued falling as a black sedan approached the prison entrance. Security personnel moved into position. Cameras from local news stations pointed toward the gates. Reporters sensed something significant was happening, even if they did not yet understand what. Inside the vehicle sat a thin man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Harold Bennett looked older than the photographs in the file. Time had left its mark on him, yet his eyes remained sharp, focused, determined. As the vehicle rolled through the gates, he stared out the window at the prison walls. For nearly a decade, he had lived with a decision that haunted him every day. Tonight, that burden would finally end. Back in the visitation room, Vincent and Grace spoke quietly. Neither knew exactly what would happen next. They only knew the truth was finally moving toward them. Do you trust him? Grace asked softly. Vincent did not hesitate. Yes. After all these years? Vincent nodded. Harold was the most honest man I ever met. Grace studied his face carefully. She realized something important. Vincent was not hoping for rescue. He was hoping for truth. Whether that truth helped him or hurt him no longer seemed to matter. A few minutes later, a group of officials entered the room. Their expressions were serious. One of them carried a sealed folder. Another held a digital recorder. Mr. Romano, the lead investigator said, Harold Bennett has arrived. The room fell silent. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken. Vincent slowly stood. The investigator continued. Before speaking publicly, he requested a private statement in the presence of specific individuals. He glanced down at a list. You, Grace Johnson, your son Anthony Romano, and legal representatives. Grace exchanged a look with Vincent. This was it. Years of questions had led to this moment. Minutes later, they gathered inside a secure conference room. Harold entered carrying a worn leather briefcase. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Harold placed the briefcase carefully on the table and looked directly at Vincent. His eyes filled with emotion. I am sorry it took me so long. Vincent simply nodded. Harold opened the briefcase. Inside were documents, letters, financial records, and one small notebook. Then he took a deep breath and revealed the truth he had carried for nearly 10 years. By the time he finished speaking, nobody in the room could believe what they had heard. And within 30 minutes, an emergency order was issued that stopped everything. The emergency order changed everything. What had been a routine evening inside the prison became a storm of phone calls, legal reviews, and urgent meetings that stretched past midnight. Attorneys who had already accepted the final outcome suddenly found themselves examining evidence they had never seen before. Investigators compared old records against Harold Bennett's notebook. Every page confirmed details that had been overlooked for years. Every signature matched. Every date aligned. Every piece fit together with unsettling precision. By sunrise, the case that once seemed closed had been reopened. Vincent sat quietly in the same visitation room where only hours earlier he had been preparing for the end of his journey. Now he stared through the window as morning light slowly painted the horizon beyond the prison walls. For the first time in many years, he felt something unfamiliar. Peace. Not because he expected freedom. Not because he expected redemption, but because the truth no longer belonged to silence. Across the room, Grace watched him carefully. She had spent 8 years running from memories she believed would only bring pain. Yet now she understood something important. The truth had never followed her because it wanted to punish her. It followed her because it needed a witness. Later that afternoon, Anthony entered the room carrying a stack of legal documents. He looked exhausted. His eyes were red from lack of sleep. Yet there was something else in his expression. Humility. He approached Grace first. For several moments he struggled to find words. Then he finally spoke. "I owe you an apology." Grace looked surprised. Anthony lowered his eyes. "I spent years believing you walked away from us. I never stopped to ask why." Grace offered a gentle smile. "Sometimes leaving is the only way people know how to survive." Anthony nodded slowly. Then, in front of his father, he thanked her. Not for coming back. Not for helping the case. But for protecting a truth that everyone else had forgotten. Several weeks later, Vincent Romano was released pending a complete judicial review. News stations covered the story across the country. Commentators debated legal failures. Experts analyzed evidence. Headlines focused on court decisions and investigative mistakes. Yet the people who truly understood what happened paid attention to something else entirely. On a quiet afternoon beside Lake Michigan, Vincent and Grace sat on a wooden bench overlooking the water. The wind moved gently across the shoreline. Sailboats drifted in the distance. Neither felt the need to speak much. Some friendships become too deep for constant conversation. After a while, Vincent looked toward the lake and smiled. "Do you remember that question I asked you years ago?" Grace laughed softly. "About whether someone could leave one good thing behind." Vincent nodded. "I finally know the answer." Grace turned toward him. Vincent's eyes reflected the sunlight dancing across the water. The answer was never a thing. His voice was quiet. It was a person. Grace looked away before tears could form. The world would remember Vincent Romano as the man whose fate changed at the last possible moment. Reporters would write articles. Historians would debate facts. Lawyers would study the case for years. But Vincent remembered something simpler. When everyone else saw a maid, he saw the one person who refused to abandon her humanity. And that day, the world remembered what dignity looks like.